everyone. Hello, hello. So glad you've decided to join me on this Saturday. I know that some people, it takes a little while to get settled, to get your stuff. So if you need to grab your coffee or your water or your pen and paper or whatever you're using, please go ahead and do that. We will begin in the next minute or two, but I do like to leave a little bit of time at the start for people to get sorted and for me to remember to do certain things. Like add captions. So I have added the captions now. We will be starting in the next minute or so. This session is on masterful moderating with yours truly. Usually we also have a host from Fold come on and share a few housekeeping type deals. I will be doing all of that. And then I'll lead into the session. So I guess by way of a brief introduction to Fold, I'll just say the Fold Academy is our virtual webinar series. We've been doing this for 4, maybe 5 years. This was the way we actually entered into the virtual space. I'm going to leave the chat open for now, so feel free to drop in hellos where you're joining from. I don't know if you all can see it, but I can see the things you're posting in the chat. So if you're here, say hello, say where you're coming in from. Our Fold Academy was a webinar series we designed to help bridge that gap, that geographical gap that a lot of people feel where they're not able to improve their skills, develop their writing, advance in the industry because they're too far away or they're not able to get to things physically. And so we started Fold Academy well before COVID and virtual became important, which became important. And that's something we've kept doing. We do it once a month. And this month, as we kick off the new season, is on masterful moderating. I'm going to flip to the next slide where you'll see our upcoming events. Our next Fold Academy event is Social Media for Authors with Lizelle Sambury. She's a young adult author. If you're not following her on Instagram, follow her on Instagram. She is phenomenal and just has really great insight on how to use social media. I'll be using live captions today. So if you would like the captions, you can turn them on. If they're not something that you need, you could just turn them off. Don't worry about the inaccuracies. That happens. We will correct it for the final posted version. We also have Iva Chung doing a session on trauma-informed editing from our on November 20th. And this is kind of a follow-up to a session that was really popular from Fold on decolonizing the editing process. And so you'll be able to do a workshop with Iva Chung exclusively, and I'm really excited about that. It would be remiss for me not to mention that we are in the throes of planning Fold Kids Book Fest. And so that's coming up November 4th to the 7th, and registration opens October 14th. You'll see lots of information about that on the Fold Kids social media side. So if you're following Big Fold, be sure to also follow Fold Kids as well. So hello, everyone. We have folks joining from all across Turtle Island, from Ottawa to Boston, Treaty 6 territory, Toronto, so many different places. So I'm really excited for you to be here. I'm going to go through just a brief bio for those of you who don't know who I am or very much about me. I'll share a little bit about that and then we'll get right into it. I tend to talk fast. So what I would like to do, and I'll mention this one more time a little bit later, is for the chat, feel free to drop your hellos. I'm here from, excited to join. But once the session begins, it's really helpful if you just use that for like questions. And I will say oftentimes I can't really see it anyways. So if you have like I missed that slide, that can sometimes get caught. But if it's a question you really want me to answer, best place to put it is in the Q&A box. One question, there's a question already in there. One question that I get a lot is, will this be available for recording? Yes, you will be able to get the recording. We'll email it to you all. And then usually we keep our Fold Academy series up for an entire year. to go back to. Okay, so my name's Jael Richardson. I am the Executive Director of The Fold, where we run three main programs. Fold, Big Fold, our festival in May, Little Fold or Fold Kids in November. And then we also have Fold Academy, which you're participating in now. Something else we also do is our reading challenge. That's sort of a fourth initiative. So those are I'm sort of oversee all of those projects. I'm also an author. I also sometimes host on CBC's Q radio show. I also do a couple of one-off events. I've been hosting a conversation between Giller shortlisted authors for many years. I'll be doing something like that again this year, I think. And so I really come at this from a couple of different places. This is, one slide to brag, perhaps, just to showcase of some of the authors that I've interviewed, some of them one-on-one, some on panels. And I love doing this work. I love interviewing authors. I love engaging with people on stage and asking questions about their work. As a writer, it helps me resolve some problems. I can think of a few instances where I've moderated and actually gone into the session to say, like, can you help me solve this problem? And so that's kind of my jam, is talking to authors. I've also curated panels and hired moderators. So I've seen some of the do's and don'ts in my own experiences and also witnessed them with others as well. What I'm really obsessed with, for those of you who know me well, is I'm really obsessed with efficiency. So part of what I want to do today is kind of walk you through how to prepare and moderate events with more efficiency, because I think there are places where we waste time. There are places where we place pressure on ourselves as moderators, and then in events end up making mistakes in terms of how we manage it. So that's sort of my goal for today. Again, Q&A box is key for today and always. It's where you should put questions that you either see me not covering, see me going over too quickly, or where you want clarification. I will probably peek in there a few times as we go through, and I will definitely, in terms of these kinds of events, I tend to leave as much time as possible at the end for questions, and I will honestly stay on as long as needed at the end, because for live attendees, that's kind of the benefit, right? You came here and I want to make sure that you get what you need in this time period. And then people who are watching back can choose to watch back as much or as little of the question and answer period as they like. So if you're watching this back and you have questions, best thing to do is maybe watch the question and answer period. So make sure you watch that all the way through to see if your question gets asked. And then maybe you can look around and see what other people have to say, or hit me up on Twitter or Instagram and ask me there. Okay, let's get rolling. All right. As I was preparing, one of my challenges in preparing for this event was I realized that I probably could do a session on moderating that was just for single person interviews, and also one that was for panel style interviews, because they're quite different, but there are some similarities. So what I'll do today is I'll try and manage both. And if you lean more towards one kind of interview, or if you have questions about the other, you'll have to just put them in the question and answer box. But just for clarification, single person interviews are one VIP guest, right? One person is the focus and you happen to be the moderator, or some people would use the word interviewer in that case because it's just one-on-one. You may use some of these skills for a podcast. You may use them for a radio interview, which I've done. But the large majority of what I'm thinking about are literary events. That's my space, that's my sphere. So when I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about a one-on-one interview, usually with an author, usually about their book. Panel styles are 2 to 4 guests, sometimes more. Just a plug, when I do virtual events for Fold, we only do panels of 2 or 3 people. I would say 3 people or less, but it's 2 or 3 people. And the reason we do that is twofold. One is on a digital screen, whether you're using your phone, your computer, your iPad, whatever, 4 people sits really nicely. So the moderator and 3 authors. Once you get 4 authors in, you have to kind of slide down and see the 5th person. It gets kind of messy. You lose track of people as a viewer. So aesthetically, I recommend 3 or 2 for virtual events. For in-person, I go up to as many as 4. This is also proven to be helpful for managing conversation. In our first year, we did not know this rule, plus we were planning for in-person and then had to transition to digital, so we had 4 in many of our panels. And it was also just that much more difficult to make sure everybody got time and everyone got involved. So 3 is the magic number of panelists for virtual, in my opinion, and 4 is the maximum I would do in person. For Giller, I usually have to do 5. And then sometimes one year they did 6, and that it's really, really hard to manage time. It's really hard to create conversation that can fit in the time frame. And so that's just a organizational recommendation. If they ask you, like, do you mind if we add one more person? Just think about that. The other thing to think about is when I'm preparing for events, I generally prepare for 30 to 40 minutes of interview content. Why? Because most literary events are an hour, hour and 10, hour and 15 is kind of the maximum. But usually, even when they're creeping into hour 10, hour 15, it's because they're incorporating readings, they're incorporating host conversation, like welcome, hello. They might even be incorporating a delay at the beginning of the event, just to allow people to get settled. And then they're also incorporating usually a Q&A. And so when it comes down to it, I prepare for about 40 minutes of interview content max, and that tends to be right, because when you put in all those things, 40 minutes is what I'm going to be personally responsible for. I don't link Q&A into that 40 minutes of interview content. So if that makes sense, some events I end up doing 30 minutes because the Q&A is a much larger portion, or the event is only an hour, and with readings and Q&A, it ends up being 30 minutes of interview content. And it's really, really important. I'm going to talk a lot about time and about managing time, and that preparation period, the part for which you're solely responsible in terms of cultivating questions and curating content, that is what we're talking about. How to manage that 40 minutes once the event is underway, the readings are done, the intros are done, you are in charge of the questions. 40 minutes is typically the max that I end up doing. And it can often be closer to 30 minutes. And a lot of times I think people miss that. They look at the fact that the event is an hour long and they think they need to prepare an hour of content. One of the common mistakes I see. Okay, another thing I want to talk about is my goals. This is really, really important when we talk about moderating goals. So of course, the obvious one is to create and facilitate good, meaningful conversation. That's rather obvious. I think that whether you're doing it with an interview, it's about creating good content. You're creating it, you're creating the conversation, the questions, and making sure that it flows. But facilitating becomes a really important part when it comes to panels, because in the end, you actually want the conversation to be not you interviewing 4 people at the same time. It's about you cultivating, creating, facilitating a conversation between 4 people, of which you may be one of the panelists. I've done a few where I'm also a panelist, but you may also be just the moderator. And I don't mean that as like a dismissal. It's about recognizing what your role is. And your goal may just be to facilitate a conversation between these 3 people who don't know each other. And that can be really, really hard. But if you recognize that that's your focus, that's your intention, it's going to change the shape, the style, the approach to your questions. The second one that I think is really important that I think people underestimate and also changes how you structure, prepare, and cultivate questions is my desire when I facilitate literary discussions is to create an urgent desire for attendees to get the book or the books. This is like pressing, critical, urgent to me. It is really important to me that everybody who comes to a literary event has a ton of books. Facts, whether they've read them, whether they have them on their e-reader, their audiobook, they're on their shelves. Generally speaking, people who come to literary events have some books. And so my goal is to make sure that by the end of the event, they feel an urgent need to get the book that I'm talking about. and that they also perhaps feel an urgent need to rise it up on their TBR pile, right? To create some sort of urgency and excitement. And that's just like me maybe being competitive and creating strange goals. But I think it's really important, especially with virtual events, knowing what authors go through, knowing how difficult it is to get recognition, space, etc. I think authors, while they love conversations, they really want to see that their books do well. And so for me, I want to make sure that when I finish a live event, people are rushing to that book signing table to get it, maybe to get a couple copies. I like to recommend gifting. And so that's an important part as well. The third one that I didn't include here, but I thought of and I want to mention is also to add value. So for those who have read the book, to create more excitement and more enthusiasm about the book by adding value, by getting the author to share something that only someone who would tune into this event would know. And so I will often through this event probably reference an interview I did recently with Emma Donoghue because it was my most recent one. And I was thinking about this panel as I was doing it. But one of the things we talked about are things that were sort of behind the scenes, like what went on as you were creating it. And so that added value is just another one that I'll mention. Okay, so some moderating do's. I'll also mention just in terms of the structure of this event, I'm going to go through some like do's, some don'ts, some basic things, and then I'm going to actually tackle like how I create my list of questions and how I handle difficult personalities. Okay, so some moderating do's. First of all, when you get asked to moderate, before you agree, this is key because it's very hard to back out of moderating once you realize, oh, this is a problem. So before you agree to moderate an event, be sure to ask questions about the honorarium. How much are you being paid? I would not accept personally less than $100 to moderate. And I typically like 100, 150, anything over 2 really excites me personally. And anything in the 500 plus, I get really jazzed about. So that's the kind of thing you want to be looking for honorariums. Again, when I was starting out, I just wanted experience and opportunities, but still, even at that early starting out stage, I don't want to do it for free. And I sort of had to set my own limit. And my limit at the start was about 100. And it still is. Also ask questions about accessibility. I refuse to do events in inaccessible venues. And so I will sort of say, if it's an in-person event, is the bathroom and the entire building accessible? Is that information posted and readily available? And that's been a priority for me as well. I also ask who the panelists are. So sometimes you'll get asked to moderate a panel and you don't know who the panelists are, and that can lead you into trouble as well. I recently turned down a moderating job because the panelists were all white women, straight white women. And I knew they were kind of using me as a token to kind of diversify the conversation. And that's also not of interest to me. So you can kind of set your own parameters and boundaries, and that's really important. Also review the parameters of the event really carefully. Understand the start and end time zones is really key, especially lately. Understand like, is there a Q&A? Are there readings? These are things you probably want to know before you agree, but you certainly want to know as you're getting closer towards the event. One thing that's really, really, really critical is to know what the hard ending is. And I usually don't ask that question until the very end of the event, like what's your hard ending? Because it's really important to know, and I'll say this, it's the last point here as well, is to manage your time carefully. It's also about respecting the time of the organizers. Sometimes, like for us, we have hard endings because we hire live transcriptions, or we might have ASL interpreters. And so sometimes there's an ending in which those folks like have to be off. And so you can't just be like, I just have one more question. You really have to understand what a hard ending is. Oftentimes what they're giving you is an ideal ending. And so you can, ask that one question or give that one person time to go over, but you just have to be aware. Another big do is to create simple, straightforward questions. Authors do not like to feel tricked or confused when they're answering questions. And this is everybody, not just authors, but it's really important. I mentioned this later as well, not to get clever with the way you're wording the question, but to be really precise in your language and to really understand what you are in fact asking. And that gives the author real clarity about how they want to respond. One of the things I do a lot, and of course people will say, you know, read the books beforehand. If it's an interview, absolutely read the whole book. If it's a panel, you may not, and oftentimes don't have time to read all 4 books by the time they actually arrive. And I will say this, if you're moderating an event, it is the festival organizer's responsibility to get you copies of the book. You shouldn't have to buy them yourself. And that's something I'm just mentioning so that you know. Typically they will send them to you, but oftentimes they don't get there on time. So that becomes the problem. So what I recommend is to read articles and reviews of the books. I often come up with really great questions based on things I've seen in articles that, of course, the article can't expand on. And I'll say something like, okay, I read this article where you talk about this story about XYZ. Tell me about that. And they can give, this is one of those added value moments, they can give more information than anybody could have got, even if they read that article. I often will also look at reviews of books. So I'll go somewhere like Goodreads, where I don't ever wait for my own books. Well, I try not to. And I'll look at what some of the criticisms about the book are, and I'll actually use the criticism to create a question. I won't ask them like, somebody said your book is terrible. That's not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is questions like, I've seen in books, the ending felt really rushed, or books where I know for my book, one of the main criticisms people get is like, it felt like it was young adult because the main character is 14 and it's told in first person. And so I will create a question that essentially allows the author to kind of explain a choice they made in the book that readers may be misinterpreting or not understanding. And so then you have people who, when they go to Goodreads to add it and they see this criticism, they're like, I already know. They already explained why that is. I've got the inside scoop. And so those really help. I also ask the author, especially if you're doing nonfiction, if there's anything that's off limits or anything that they feel is really important to cover. Oftentimes, especially with marginalized writers, there's kind of like a key thing that people keep latching onto and getting really excited about. And sometimes that's being misunderstood, misinterpreted, over exploited. And sometimes there's something else that they feel is really more valuable to pay attention to, but they just can't get any traction on it. So I will ask them those kinds of questions to give them space to say, I love talking about blah, blah, blah. And I mentioned managing time carefully. I'm gonna check. So great question about whether I be sharing my slides. I don't generally share my slides, but I will share the whole presentation will be shared. So you can go back and get information and that kind of thing. There's some really great questions about tools and specifically about sort of captioning and services that we use. I'm going to save that to the end just because some folks who might have come specifically for moderating might not have come for that, but I want to make sure I do address it. So patience, I guess I will say. Okay, so some moderating don'ts. These are my top 8 don'ts. Some of them overlap a little bit because they're so strong for me. Some of them are in bright colors because they're really strong for me. For me, one of the big ones is don't favor one writer in an event over another. This has happened. I've seen this happen multiple times, and it's done with the best of intentions. You're doing a panel, you've read the book by one author and you really like it. You may not have read the other books, or you may just not like them as much. And so they say, oh my gosh, I loved your book. I need you to sign it. I loved the way you did that. Never, ever, ever. Every author knows what it feels like to be the author who is not included in that, like, I loved your book, and also it just sends a bad vibe. The whole group feels like the moderator kind of favors one person. They feel kind of, I will say, writers are sensitive creatures. And so you want to really create an environment in which everyone feels equal, right? There's no celebrities on a panel. When a panel's been created, they're all equals. And so you can't be like, congratulations on this award or do this, and everybody else is just sitting there being like, okay, right? So don't favor one writer over the other, and be very, very, very aware of how your questions can favor someone, even in terms of time. Don't use moderating as an opportunity to self-promote. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious, and yet I see it happen all the time where people kind of mention their own books and their own writing. When you're doing an interview, there's a little bit more wiggle room here, right? You might need to mention your book or where you're coming from in order to explain where your question's coming from. So I might say, yeah, the book I'm working on right now is set in present tense, and you did historical fiction, but I'm curious if, you might actually use yourself to reference. But it's when you're like, my book called this, and published by this person. And I've seen people talk too much about themselves. And so you really want to be aware of that. On a panel, time is so precious that ain't nobody got a time for you and your stories and your personal life, okay? And your books. That's not what you're there for. I've got time for you outside of that, but inside that event, people have come to see the authors talk, and you just really need to be mindful of that. Again, this is just a reference. A lot of times moderators feel pressure to show their intelligence, to show how deeply they read the book or all the hidden themes that they were able to draw out. Really not the point of the event. The point is to sell, recommend, promote the author and their work. So it doesn't matter that you found this hidden meeting and these codes that showcase how deep of a reader you are. That's not the point. So avoid those kinds of questions. Don't ask about specific, number 4 is don't ask about specific reviews or experiences without asking permission. I'll also tie this in there, that happens a lot with fiction, and it happens from reviewers to events to whatever, where people assume the book is about the person's life. Don't do that. It's not. So ask them a question about the way they told the story or the choices they made for a character. Not, is this about something that happened to you, XYZ? Number 5 is don't use long preambles. One of the biggest and most common mistakes for new moderators is they write very long questions or they set the question up as though there needs to be a defense of why the question is asked. Sometimes it's helpful, and I would say you get one preamble a session, one, and it can't be the first question. If you want to sort of set up a question and say, I was reading this book and I just want to read you this quote by, Maya Angelou. And the quote says, blah, 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 blah. And when I was reading that, it made me think about these books, and here's the question I want to ask. And then you ask the question. That's the longest preamble you're allowed to do, and only one. You're only allowed to create your own stories within the event once, and you don't have to, right? I often do events where there are no preambles, and that's, and if people are like, what is a preamble? Preamble is that long setup. You see it often when writers do readings as well. They're going to read chapter 1, but for some reason they feel a reason to like set up the story. So this book is about this kind of person, and this book is about this. Like, just read the book, especially if it's chapter 1, should be obvious. If it's chapter 2 or 3, just give us the essentials. And so with moderating, you want to do the same thing. Keep it to the essentials, keep it to clear questions, because again, sometimes what happens is the author can get lost in the preamble. Your question might be the first part of it, and then you've said all this background, and now they're like, well, what was the question again? Or you have to repeat it and you're taking even more time. Don't do it. Number 6, don't go over time. Do not disrespect the organizers and the planners by going over time. And this also means that you're responsible if there's an author who's constantly going over time. If an author is constantly going over time and you have chance for like 1 minute to ask one more question, don't ask that author or set it up to say just quickly 1 sentence or 2 and ask the question. If they go over, that's outside of your control. And frankly, they look like a fool. And they show themselves to be someone who can't stick to time. But really, it's your responsibility to manage time and the way time flows. Number 7, do not, under any circumstances, reveal major spoilers. How do you know it's a spoiler? Well, you're a reader. You should know what a spoiler is. But here's my rule on spoilers. If it's in the blurb, it's not a spoiler. If it's in the first 50 pages, it's also not really a spoiler. Getting into 100 pages, again, it depends on the length of the book. So if it's a 150-page book, 100 pages is probably too far. But 100 pages in is like the maximum for like new reveals and content. I'll give you an example. I'm going to check my own book just to make sure. I'm pretty sure. No, it isn't actually. Okay, I'm going to do one from Gutter Child and then show you a spoiler. Sorry for anyone who hasn't read it. But in the first 100 pages or so, Elamina, the main character, gets pregnant. And so sometimes in events, people will ask if it's okay to bring that up. And I will say, yes, you can mention that it's pregnant, because one of the things that's probably a curiosity as people get into the book is who the father is. And so so long as we don't talk about the father, we can talk about Elamina as a mother and some of the things I wanted to explore in that. But that's the spoiler that people are allowed. And then I sort of set up the parameters. So don't reveal major spoilers. Why is this important? Again, you're trying to get people to be excited about buying, about getting that book. And when you reveal major spoilers, people like me who love to read for plot, to figure out what's happening, how it's happening, who's going to get where, how it's going to go about, people like me will actually not read a book if I know the major spoiler. If I pick it up and I know the main thing that's supposed to be holding me there, I'm kind of like, meh, disinterested. So don't reveal major spoilers. The only exception is if you're doing a book club. If you're doing a one-on-one interview and it's a book club, it's fair game, because for a book club, generally speaking, people are supposed to have read the book. And if they haven't, they know that that's kind of the expectation and they're ready for spoilers. For example, I never go to a book club if I haven't read a book, because I hate spoilers. Number 8 is don't treat the interview like a private conversation. This kind of ties back to what I was saying about these really like intricate details that you found in reading the book, where you're just kind of like getting wrapped up in like your connection with the author and not remembering that when you're on stage as a moderator, you're a reader who's trying to bring other readers along with you, trying to get other readers excited about the book, trying to get other readers to know things that you want to know. You're not two buddies having a chat that people are just tuning in to watch. And that's kind of how I see it. So some do's and don'ts. These are some of the, I'm seeing your questions. So basically at the end of every panel, I kind of look back on the questions and see what people are asking. And so this is really, I will come to all of these. I think there's a place to answer them. These are kind of this, when I'm looking at preparing questions, it's one of the hardest parts of moderating is figuring out good questions. When I'm preparing questions, I generally have three core areas of topic study and kind of different subheadings under each of those categories. It's not exhaustive for sure, especially subjects I can go on forever and ever. But I generally put my conversations into 3 main sections. One of the areas is process. And so these are questions about the author's style. Do they plot, or do they just write and then edit later? Do they always know what they're working on next, or do they work on multiple projects at the same time? These are kind of my process-based questions. I love questions about choices. So how did you decide? Or why did you choose this name for this main character? Or why did you choose this particular story or this particular person? I love choice questions. I also love challenge questions. So what were challenges that you came across and how did you overcome them are like my great ones for being like, tell me how to fix my problems. And so those are sort of process-based questions. I always have a lot of subject-based questions. So settings, plot, narrative voice, time period. I might ask, I remember doing one Giller interview and the books two were set in Newfoundland. One was in Italy. One was short stories. So they kind of went into different places. And the other one, I can't remember right now, but it'll come to me. But anyways, what I asked as one of the questions was, how did where you grew up, influence how you told the story about where your story is set? So for some people, they were writing stories that were set in the places where they grew up, very similar. Some people were writing about places that were very different, right? And so the question gave me an opportunity to learn a little bit about them. It led them into a question, well, I grew up in, I was born and raised in, and now I live here, and I was writing about there, right? So there was really, really great conversation that came from that question that was rooted in setting. Plot questions, different people pace their novels different ways. So it's a great panel type question too, because it allows for plot. I get a lot of room to like have people sort of defend the way in which they told the story. And so that's kind of how I work my way through. With a panel, what I'm generally trying to do is allow room for similarity and difference. I want them to be able to talk about, maybe multiple people have young characters and you got young main characters. And so I might ask, how did you approach writing younger characters, and have a sub question that's about the other folks. So you guys had older characters, and I'll sort of separate the group in two, but be able to ask them all essentially a very similar question about character. And then marketing, I love asking questions about title, covers, blurbs. And those are really easy questions to get right off the bat without even having read the book. And again, I'm not pitching don't read the book. I'm just pitching some cheats that help you create questions even when you might not get to read the book. Target audience is also a great one. I talk a lot, it depends on the kind of group that you're working with, but that can be one. And you can also talk about social media, how people balance what's happening and being said on social media with what they're writing. So preparing. So what I have are those kinds of ideas in my head, right? That table of questions is what I'm always pulling from, because I'm doing probably moderating 5 to 10 events a year minimum. And so I'm trying to figure out how to do it differently for people who are watching multiple events that I moderate, but also how to save time. So when I'm preparing, and this is probably like the magic in terms of preparation, when I'm doing a one-on-one interview, remember we're working with that 40-minute model for interview time. I am looking for 6 to 8 core questions for a one-on-one interview. 6 to 8 core questions. For a panel, I'm looking for 4 to 6. And I would say 9 times out of 10, 4 or 5 is the sweet spot for panels. And a lot of people prepare 10 questions for panels. And then they're like, oh my gosh, I have so many questions, I didn't get through them all. Here's the solution. Only prepare 4 or 5. Prepare up to 8 for me for panels so that you have extras in case. But like when you have a panel of 3 or more people, guaranteed 4 to 5 questions is going to cover your 40-minute time frame, right? That's, if I was really into math, I would break it down for you in some way that would be really clever. And you'd be like, she's so impressive. But I would do something along the lines of like, you have 40 minutes, you have 8 questions, that leaves you 5 minutes for each question. And if you have 3 or 4 panelists, that means they're answering in a minute, 2 minutes or less, and on the less side, right? If you just do that math, most people are going to take more than 2 minutes to answer a question. And this is just for core questions. Keep in mind, for me, when I set up core questions, sometimes I also have sub questions underneath those core questions. I'll give you an example of that in a moment. I also have to be prepared for flexible questions that I just have to ask because they're just there and ripe for the taking. And that's what makes for really great moderating. So I'll give you an example. When I was interviewing Emma Donahue, I had a question about her setting. It was a setting-based question. I wanted to know why, first of all, I wanted to know why she chose to write historical fiction, why she set it at this time in this place. And that was like, she took like a good 3 to 4 or 5 minutes maybe to answer that in a really beautiful and comprehensive way. My next question was, okay, why this maternity ward? It was, the book was The Pull of the Stars. This is her most recent book, The Pull of the Stars. And it's set in a maternity ward during COVID, but like during a pandemic, not specifically COVID, but that's all I can think about, of course. And so I asked her a question about why it was set in a maternity ward. That was sort of my sub question under setting. And then she said, I really love constraints. I love putting my characters in small rooms and small spaces and forcing them to talk. And she referenced Room, which was one of her most popular books. And I was like, okay, well, I have to ask why, like she threw that out there, but like, we need to know more. Like why would you do that to yourself? As a writer, I'm thinking, why would you set yourself up to only have one space for your characters to be in? And of course I wanted to ask that about Room, and she gave me space to do it through Pull of the Stars. So we got into this sub-flexible question. This is why for me, 6 to 8 core questions and 4 to 6 core questions is always enough, because there's always something more you can pull from the conversation. And if you prepare 10 questions, 12 questions, knowing, mathematically speaking, it's actually impossible to get through them all. What you'll do is you'll rush. You'll have created 12 questions you're obsessed with, you love, and you'll rush through the questions you ask so that you can get to where you want to go. So I always prepare 6 to 8 core questions, 4 to 6 core questions for panels, and I always rank them. So I'll say, and I'll show this in a little bit of a later one, I'll also say which ones I definitely want to cover and which ones I'll sort of like throw to the sides if time goes the way I think it will. Remember, for interviews, you kind of have to be active in the event. You can't just throw out questions. You have to respond and ask questions. Whereas with panels, you're trying to create that environment with your panelists. You're trying to get them to be like, oh, you know, it's so weird that you say that, Sam, because like when I was working on the book, I felt the complete opposite. And then the other person to be like, really, I kind of agree. That makes for the best event. When you've asked a question and someone else is like, oh, yes, and the other person is like, but no, you get so much richness for the audience and the authors when you can create that kind of space. And that's what making core questions and kind of prioritizing that allows you to do. Remember, in interviews, to be flexible to the author. You want to kind of go with wherever they lead. And in panels, you want to do the opposite. You don't want to go wherever the authors lead because you'll end up down a rabbit hole and not able to find your way out. So you really want to manage far more in the panel than you do have to do in the interview. All right, so question flow. I've kind of hinted at this. I've kind of talked about this in the previous slide, but when I actually get down to writing, and I'll share this with you right now. You can see, I'll show you what the page for the Emma Donoghue interview looked like. These were my notes for the Emma Donoghue interview. So you'll see I have, where was the starting point of the novel? What's the process? Does it change throughout the novel? I have this section on craft that so I made a couple questions and then I listed craft, and then I'm kind of writing all over the page. The ones at the bottom, I will say down here, are actually questions I started to write during the interview. So I also will throw away questions and add in questions based on what the author's giving me. And so these ones on the diagonal, I think, were either late adds, actually more of these ones. The ones that are numbered were probably in advance of the event because I tried to put them in an order, and you'll see, right? That's 7 core questions. And what did I say for an interview? 4 to 6. And I sort of rank them. And so I'm willing to throw some of them away. I also write at the top of my page the main characters' names, because no matter how well you know the story, you will start to say something like Bridie Sweeney, and you'll be like, was that really the name? Did I just make that up? And so I'll write the main character's name. I'll write the setting. It was set in Dublin in 1918, so sort of cheats as I'm talking. So when I do my preparation, I'll write a whole bunch of questions down. So my next interview one-on-one is with Ian Williams on disorientation. So I'll take notes in the book, and then I'll take notes on a page about questions I have to ask him as I'm reading the book. And then I'll try and identify 2 to 6 core questions, depending on if it's a panel or an interview. And I'll try and identify a beginning question. So I really like my moderating events to have flow, to start at the beginning where the author began and to end somewhere new. So I'll give you some really like classic beginning questions. I often will ask like a very basic one that I would try and reword so I sound more clever, just reword it, not like add to it, is, you know, what was the idea behind this novel? How did this novel come about? Or when did you decide you were going to write a memoir? Like I'll try and get set up for the reader to learn a little bit of this is like the bonus content. And it's also to get us all kind of on the same page. And so I'll do some kind of beginning question. I may have 2. I may have one that's like pre-book, like what does it feel coming out of an award win? Or what does it feel like after some of the challenges you faced, I don't know, in something. And then the next question might be, okay, this book, what was the idea behind the title, right? Those are all kinds of beginning questions. Then I'll have the 2 to 6 core questions, which I start with in terms of my note taking. So it's just in the core questions about trying to word them in a way or order them in a way that makes sense, right? I don't want to get too deep into characters if I haven't even set up like what the story is about in a main way. And then I'll often have an ending question. A very basic, very common ending question is like, what are you working on now? Or what's next for you? And so that's kind of the general framework for the event. A couple other things. All right. This is probably one of the things that's most difficult, trickiest, and like you can't really prepare other than getting more and more experience. But dealing with personalities is one of the really challenging parts. And it can be whether it's a one-on-one interview or it can be in a panel. It can all kind of come together and form disaster if you're not kind of prepared. And oftentimes I think what happens is you end up leaving the event or watching it back and thinking, I didn't hear enough from so-and-so, or I heard way too much from so-and-so and I didn't know how to fix it. And so these are kind of my tips for dealing with not difficult. That was the wrong word, just personalities. So the quiet introvert is very common. A lot of writers are generally quiet and introverted. They can be quiet and introverted, particularly around new people, particularly going on stage or presenting. It often ties in with nervous. The difference between nervous is someone who's nervous may get more comfortable as the event goes on and may become a talker as the event goes on. So the quiet introvert is really the person that throughout the event is going to be entirely happy, not sharing, and they're going to be particularly concerned about sounding wrong, or they're just going to be okay saying very little, honestly, in a lot of cases. And what's really important as a moderator when I deal with quiet or introverted people is to really respect their needs and their process. And one of the things that introverts really need, and rightfully so, is time to process the question. So if you know someone is quiet and introverted, they are the worst person to call on first, especially for a difficult question, especially for a question that quantifies like what was the most difficult thing you went through, or what, anything that's sort of asking them to rank their experience, because they're going to really want to think through it. An extrovert, I happen to know, will just say the first thing that comes to mind. But an introvert will think, well, they said the most difficult thing. I had some challenges, but I wouldn't describe them as difficulty. Like an introvert is a thinker. They're like a real genuine listening soul. And so when you ask them first, they feel concerned that they don't have all the information or they haven't understood the question. Whereas if somebody else goes first, they'll be like, oh yeah, well, I have something similar, or they'll just have time to process their own question. And that's been my experience. It's also important that you give them space to answer questions. So I'll often try to find at least one question that I can go to an introvert or quieter person first. What kind of question is that, do you ask? Well, an introvert, even though they might not want to share a whole lot or might be less likely to speak out first, they're not incapable. They're just like a process differently. So one of the things with an introvert is I might ask them a question that's really specific to their book, or really points to the specificity of their book. So I might say something like, I use Sam as an example because it's very gender neutral and short, and it feels like culturally there might be a Sam in every culture. So Sam, I noticed in the opening chapter of your book, there's a lot of time spent really helping us understand what Lagos looked like at that particular time that you're starting the novel. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And that's likely going to be a question they've either heard before, prepared for before, or just understand because they know their novel really, really well. And so I try and lead off with like a setting question that's specifically about their, that will work for them. And so that's what I try and do for quieter or introverted writers. There's also humble or truncated authors who will shrink what they're saying, shrink how long they take because they're really aware that they shouldn't take up room, almost to a fault. I'm going to name drop somebody here. You can tell him, but don't. Omar El-Akkad is like this. If you've ever seen Omar El-Akkad, who wrote American War and most recently What Strange Paradise, he has some of the most brilliant answers I've ever heard. He can he can take a question first and answer it as though he wrote an essay about it yesterday. It's impressive, but he's also extremely humble. So he won't actually expand unless you kind of give him permission and he's reminded that it's okay. And again, you have to be aware, do you actually have time? But you have to, I think it's really important to encourage people who are sharing thoughtfully and are just sort of maybe holding back to be safe to say, like, you can share a little bit more. Over talkers, on the other hand, do not give them an inch, they take a mile every time. I know them. So you want to carefully plan and organize for extroverts. The great thing about extroverts is you can go to them first on any question. The problem with extroverts is they sometimes have no sense of time and sometimes don't care, right? They're going to go off and on and on and on and on. And so you really want to learn that early on. Sometimes it's about responding in the moment. They might answer the first question really long, and then you want to kind of make them maybe the last person to answer the next question, so that there's a lot of distance between when they answered first and when they answered last. So even if they take a long time, it's kind of balanced by the content in between. So there's little strategies that you'll figure out for how to manage overtalkers. Don't go to an overtalker or an extrovert late in the game when time is like running down. And if you do, set parameters. So especially on the radio, I have to do this a lot. So we only have a minute left. Quickly, like maybe just a few sentences. What were your thoughts about X? Or what are you working on next, right? Keep that, really help them manage themselves by setting up the parameters around them. Celebrities can also be a challenge, and it's more of a challenge in the Q&A when people just want to ask the one person a question, or they're constantly saying, I love so-and-so, I love this, and there's a panel of 3 people. It's really about adjusting to make sure people hear from everybody and not allowing one person, especially in the Q&A period, to take up all the answering time. I think it's important, as I said, on a panel to just treat everybody like they're equals, because they are. Ain't nobody special. Okay. Question and answer. As I'm modeling this behavior, I'm coming up to the end. And so I'm going to get to some of the questions that are already in the Q&A. If you have some, this is your time to drop them in there. And this is an example of how you want to handle Q&As. Most literary events that I do have a question and answer period. Obviously on the radio, this doesn't happen, but in literary events, virtual or in person, and there's a couple things that are a little bit different for each. But what you want to be mindful of with the Q&A is that people need to be prepared. It takes unless someone comes into the event with questions, and there's usually a few. There were some of you who put some questions in right off the top. I know you came prepared, but most people are coming to gather information, and they don't know what information they're missing until you're like almost done, right? So I like to say to people, hey, we're coming to the end. This is the time to drop some questions in the question and answer box. And then I'll actually say again, right before the very last question. So like my ending question, I'll say, this is it. If I get to the end of this question and there's nothing in the Q&A box, we're leaving. It's over. So if you want us to stay, ask some questions. If you haven't heard what you want to hear, ask the questions and we'll put it out there. So reminders are key. In that regard, be prepared to pose a question or two of your own if no one else does. So when I do this workshop and I'm hosting, somebody else is doing the actual workshop, I will actually prepare questions myself that I'm ready to ask to give people more time in their Q&A. So let's say the author did the workshop and they didn't remind anyone at any point, and suddenly they're like, it's over, question time. And people are like, ah. So I will always be prepared with questions in order to delay and give the audience a chance to put their questions in. If you're doing in person in particular, but also for virtual events, and I want to just commend this group because the questions I've seen in there are very precise, very short, very clean, very neat. Part of that is because you have to type them. When people talk, they just go off. But set boundaries, especially for in-person events. And for in-person events, I have a few. One is, it has to be a question and you only get one of them. Those are 2. And then my third one that I often mention is it has to be motivated by kindness and genuine curiosity. So if you're asking a question to be like, y'all seem to write about race a lot. What do you think about that? That is not a question based on kindness or genuine curiosity. That's just based on rudeness. And so you want to be able to set boundaries. And just underneath that, you also have to be prepared to deal with those people who break those boundaries. And if you set a boundary, to enforce it. So if someone comes up and says, blah, 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 these are my 7 questions, you're like, which question would you like the panel to answer? Because they're not answering all 7. Another thing, I mentioned this in the slide before, but don't allow a single person to be the sole focus. I've been on a panel where the moderator in person contributed to the audience's curiosity over one person. And so the whole question and answer period, 2 authors were sitting there, like 3 of us were sitting there like, and the moderator was just talking to the one author and the audience kept asking questions because it works out that way. You've got to manage the Q&A as well to make sure there's balance. Keep an eye on your time. I would say in most Q&As, if you have 5-minute Q&A, that's basically 1 question. If it's a panel, for sure. You might get 2 in with an interview, but for a panel, that's 1 person answering each question, that question each. If it's 10 minutes, that's 2, maybe 3 questions that you're going to get in. And if you're a little bit higher, that's where it gets flexible. So remember that sort of math when you're preparing for the Q&A, because it may also influence the type of questions you pick from the question and answer box. If you know you're only going to get 1 or 2 in, don't pick the one that's only for the 1 person, or don't pick the one that already repeats something that you asked. Pick good questions. I love it when questions come in from things I haven't covered or thought of that are also relevant, because it adds to the event. It means you're adding more content, more added value, even in that question and answer period. The last thing I'll just reiterate is you have to manage disrespectful, awkward, unkind questions. And it's really hard. I can't give you like an equation for how to deal with it. I will say I am terrible if I deal with it for the first time, but if I've seen it happen before, same question, just different scenario, place, I'm usually pretty good because I'll just copy what I've been overthinking since the last time it happened. But it's really important to manage that. I was at an event where we're all BIPOC writers, all dealing with a diversity-based panel. It was really uncomfortable. We were all kind of nervous, and we set up rules at the beginning. These are the kinds of questions. We won't talk about this. Don't ask about this, kind of thing. Very respectful, just like we got to manage our own minds. And so this is how we're going to do it. And a woman got up and violated that, like asked questions, and someone else just disrespected. And we used it as a teaching moment, but we also didn't, I can't remember if we answered the question or not, but we use it as a demonstration for people of like, look, this is what happens when you set up rules and boundaries, people try and push them. So you've got to be, as the moderator, able to recognize that and defend your authors. And you can just say, I don't know if anyone wants to answer this question, but I don't think that's one of the questions that I'm really comfortable putting forward to the panel. So thank you for asking, but we're going to go on to something else. And that's how I would handle it. I wouldn't want to like make it so the authors can't answer, but I also don't want to turn to them, ask them the question, and have them have to deal with that. So I kind of find phrases and language that I'm comfortable with that doesn't feel like I'm tearing someone down, even if they deserve to be. Sometimes I have, but usually I just try and be as polite as possible, despite the fact that people haven't earned it. Okay, so that was it. That's the main sort of content that I had planned to go through. These are the closing dates and events. I'm going to open the question and answer box, and eventually I'll stop share as well, so you can see more of me, which is of course what everybody came for. And then we'll go from there. Okay. I'm going to work from the bottom up, because some of the questions at the top were more about software and things like that I want to get to. But so this is a question about, what is your strategy for dealing with a panelist who is talking for too long when you need to end, for example? Is there a polite way to cut them off? Yes and no. If someone is really outrageously off the time, what I really just try and do is demonstrate that they're choosing to be obnoxious, because I feel like that's kind of what my goal becomes. So I will say something like, Usually it's hard because what's happened before is, that as soon as you ask them a question, they're just going to expand. So I try and narrow the question down as much as possible, as opposed to letting them like meander all over the place. If they're just doing that, sometimes I'll also ask a question where I won't include them. I have done that before, where I'll have a panel and I'll say, because I haven't heard from a particularly quiet person, something I also prepare that I didn't put in here is I usually prepare a question that's only for one person. So each person, I have one question that's only for them. And so if somebody's really over talking, I will exclude them from a question by asking the other two panelists a single person question. And that's one of the other strategies I use. The one I use at the end when I'm really nervous about asking them a question, because I know we have limited time and they don't know how to manage time, is that one where I say, we're just wrapping up. We're going to turn it over to the Q&A in a minute. But if you can just like really quickly tell me X, right? And I'll sort of set up that time is running out. And that way people know I've done everything I can. What do you do if you sense an author's answer or story is veering inappropriate or potentially offensive? This is really tricky because I think that's really, there's a couple of things. If it's on a panel, so I guess the question is, somebody has shared something inappropriate or disrespectful. How do you handle it as the moderator? I saw actually Denise Balkasoon do this at a panel where there was just like something pretty racist was shared and controversial, but not. And she asked a polite question as a follow-up to sort of give the person room to clarify in a way that might have helped them, and it got worse and she got criticized for it. So I will say it's not your responsibility to solve all the problems in the panel. But if you do, it's tricky. If it's a panel, what you can kind of do is set it up so that maybe some of the other panelists can help provide contradiction. So in this particular panel, for example, there was one author who I think Denise knew had a better approach to these topics. And so she went to that author, and that author's contribution helped balance out what was so offensive about what the other person says. So you can kind of use somebody else on the panel to help leverage. If it's an interview, it's tricky because you can't necessarily call them out. I once had an author say something that wasn't true in their interview, and I called them on it, but I tried to do it in a way that was like, I don't know, but I found this one scene where this happened. They said something about how in one of the characters, people were constantly saying that the person was offensive or gross or whatever. And she was like, I really like him. He's a nice person. And I was like, well, here's this one scene where this happens, right? And so if you know it, you can kind of correct it that way, but it's generally hard. That's one of the hard things about moderating. I'm wondering if you can speak to some of the things to be mindful of when moderating virtual versus in-person event. It's so much harder to read social cues online, so you are a bit more hands-on in terms of speaking order. Thank you for asking this. Yes. When you're moderating virtual events, one of the greatest challenges is that people don't feel as comfortable jumping in and leaning into an idea or arguing. There's worries about technical delays and glitches. And there's this sense that like, if I talk and someone else talks, how do we handle that? And that's where moderating can be really, really key, because it can be about, hey, oh, I can see both of you are answering. Casey, why don't you start? And then Sam, you can go next. See, Sam's everywhere. And so you do have to take a more active role. When I'm moderating virtual events, I don't ask open questions that just like, does somebody want to answer? Anyone? I'll ask a question and then I'll say, Sam, why don't you go first? Casey, we'll get you after, right? Like I will actually more actively script who I'm going to go to first and who I'm going to go to first on each question to kind of mix it up. So I'm a lot more, like I said, I manage a lot more when I'm doing a virtual panel than when I'm doing an in-person, and then obviously when I'm doing a one-on-one. How do you find qualified authors who will agree to be interviewed or to be on a panel? The only reliable way I've found is through personal networking. Yeah, this is tricky. In my field, we know what books are out. And so generally when an author has a book out, they they want to be on as much things as possible. So it's not as difficult if you're paying attention to like what's coming out and what's popular. Yeah, so if a book is coming out, what's usually happens is for the first 6 months, authors know that they are doing like free events, not free, they get paid, but they're free for events to promote their book. Michelle asked, how do you interrupt an overtalker? One of the things I learned when I was working on documentary interviews, and this is where Kathy's question about in-person versus virtual. In person, there are body things that you can do that some people will recognize where you kind of lean in, and that means you're listening. And when you lean back, people automatically, or you go to grab something, grab your water, people automatically know that you sort of clued out, and they feel this sense of like wrapping up. The problem is that like real overtalkers, they don't care. And I actually say when I have an overtalker, when I have somebody who reads over the amount, when I've seen someone on a panel just disrespect their fellow panelists that way, I actually don't invite them to events. And that's something maybe as organizers to keep in mind. I watch other events and I will not invite someone who disrespects other people in that way. So while it might be difficult in the moment, I don't set myself up to have that happen twice. And I often will turn down events if there's an author who I feel is particularly contentious or disrespectful. So in the moment, it's difficult to interrupt them, and I have. It's sort of like, hey, Sam, sorry to interrupt. I just have one more question that I want to make sure I get Sally into, or Harpreet into. Like, you know, that's the kind of thing I'll do. I will interject if it's that obvious, but usually for me, it's like someone takes 6 or 7 minutes instead of 5, and that's just annoying because you can't really correct them because the audience might not even really notice. So someone asked a question about self-moderating panels, and can you just clarify if you mean that you're on the panel as well, or you like, I think I know what you mean actually. So I think what you mean is like when you're on a panel where you don't have someone providing the questions, and you've sort of like, I have one, I just met with Taya Mutonji yesterday because we're doing an event and there's no moderator, right? So what I do with those ones is I try and find like what are sort of our common areas of interest and questions that we want to ask. And then we just kind of like, you have to trust the other person and kind of take turns bringing up topics. So you sort of say, okay, we're going to cover COVID, we're going to cover the writing process, and we're going to cover our latest books. And so you sort of let the conversation go in that area for a particular amount of time. And then one person intrinsically says, okay, I want to make sure we get in questions about this. And so you sort of have to set up categories. Those core questions are really helpful there because you can sort of set up the core questions, core issues, and try and create lumps of conversation, hopefully cover it just in a casual way, and then move more formally and intentionally when you feel like you've covered that topic enough, or where you feel like you need to leave enough time for another topic. I've seen some panels where an author is asked about a minor character and they have forgotten the details and it feels awkward, as you can imagine. Do you avoid asking about minor characters? Would that fall into some of the personal conversation, deep details, or things you want to recommend avoiding? If you're going to ask about secondary characters or minor characters, you should have those characters listed yourself. I literally forgot the name of one of my characters, Tilly, and I was like, I don't know, it's been 8 months, I can't remember her name. And as a moderator, what would embarrass me is not being able to provide that answer for the author. And that may seem strange. You may think it's the author's book, they should remember the name. But if you're going to ask about it, you should know the name. And so I don't think that's necessarily like deep details. I think it's more of, if you want to know something about a secondary character, if you want to ask about a secondary character, mention the secondary characters you're interested in. So if you say, hey, I want to ask you about some of, you have this great protagonist, but you also have these amazing secondary characters. I'm thinking of Ida and Tilly and this, how did that come about? How did you enjoy, or why did you choose to include them, kind of thing? And then you've already given them the answers, and especially where you're coming from. What makes a good beginning question for a one-on-one interview, especially in terms of making the interview engaging right away? So for a one-on-one interview beginning question, The one thing that you can do in an interview that you can't do in a panel is you can do career questions. You can cover their whole journey. So what I like to do for a beginning question in a one-on-one interview is I like to find something that feels very current, but also collective of their past. So for Emma Donoghue, I think that beginning question is there. I had what was the starting point for this novel, but what I think what I ended up asking her, what I want to know is, she had this long journey. She, people know her for publishing, Room and many of the books that came after, but she had published many books before that, plays and that sort of thing. And so my question was, how do you come up with the next idea at this point? And has that changed over time? In terms of how you decide what book you do next? Has it always been the same process, same experience, or is that changing as you've written so many pieces? So that's the kind of thing that I try and get them, like, how did we get here? And that's a way that you can think about it. Like, how did we get here to this book? Or how has the experience since your last big thing affected how you're entering into this next big thing? That kind of stuff. So Suvanka Thamavangsa, who won the Giller last year, you might ask a question along the lines of, so you won the Giller, but before that you were writing poetry. Has this changed? Has the Giller changed everything about the way you work? Right, that kind of thing. What do you do if an event asks what's your rate without giving any sense of what their budget might be? Hate that question. If you're asking people what their rate is, it's terrible. When I ask people for Fold, when I ask people what their rate is, I'm usually trying to figure out, I don't, and I think that I will say, as I'm getting angry, usually the motivation is you don't want to offend someone. And what you want to find is what they typically, and what I usually say is, what do you typically charge for a project like this? We did this recently with an illustrator. What do you typically charge for a project like this? And they will say anywhere from here to here. And then I can say, we would like to pay you this. Or I won't accept less than this. And sometimes I actually pay them more. So my question isn't asking to figure out how little I can pay them. It's to ask them what they expect from a project like this and whether we can make that work or whether we think it should actually exceed that. So if an event asks you that, I would say, what do you typically pay moderators? Like, what's your range? And then you take the top of that range, obviously. And if it's below your range, then you just say no. I have said no because the payment wasn't high enough. How do you handle introducing the panel participants? I didn't include this, Jacob, but thank you for asking because this is a really important one. Bios are a hot mess. You have such a mix with bios, super long bios, super full of award bios, and then you have bios that are very short, people who have not won awards. I'm going to stop the share because you guys have that now. You have people who have not won awards. You have all this range. And so when I do bios, especially for panels, I try and make them as even as possible, and I try and make them as natural as possible. If people want to know what awards a certain author has won, go to Wikipedia, go to the book cover, whatever. What I'm interested in is, okay, we're going to interview Emma Donoghue. Many of you probably know her from Room. You might also know her from this book and this book. She's of course won awards, including the Giller, and and I'll sort of throw out things that I can remember and share as naturally as possible, as opposed to born in Dublin in 1969, Emma Donoghue is an Irish immigrant, and that's not how I like to go around it. So try and keep it natural. And if you're on a panel, try and keep it balanced. Don't share too much. It is okay. I did a panel with Ian Williams, Louisa Anome, and Trey Anthony. And Louisa's a brand new book, has no awards as yet. She's going to, she's amazing. Ian's obviously won the Giller. And so I did recognize some of the awards they had won, but really one-liners. You might know from winning the Giller, Louisa's a brand new author from Brampton, Ontario, right? So I'm going to set it up in a way that nobody's getting this long resume. Okay. So there are some questions now about moderating and holding events. That I'm going to go into that are really about accessibility tools. So for captioning, when I'm moderating event and it's on Zoom, captioning is easy. It's not perfect, as you've probably seen, but you can actually just click on closed captioning and you can choose live transcript, and it will automatically, for any Zoom event that you're a part of, create live captions. They're very inaccurate at the end of the day. So what we do as a team is, before we post it, we go and correct all the captions. So if you're wondering why there's a delay in posting the video, that is why. The team has to go in manually and check all the places where I said Jael and recognize that the Zoom does not know how to spell my name. And so we use live transcripts for any single person event. When we do events at the Fold or panels or multi-person events, we always pay for a captioner, because it's really important that in the captions you can differentiate who's speaking, and that takes an incredibly long time when you're doing it from the live transcripts. And so the captioners do all that organizing and prepping. Okay, I'm going to go back down to the end. Curious if you've had any further thoughts on balancing prepared questions versus flexible questions that come up in conversation. Yes. So I rely a lot on instincts. I'm trying to listen to the person answer, right? So the goal for me when I'm preparing is to have a structure that with a robot would fill the time and satisfy my interests, right? I'm working with a robot. I ask these questions. If I ask, my Alexa's not plugged in. If I ask Alexa these questions, Alexa's going to answer them. And then I'm going to go on to the next question. When I'm actually in an event, I'm then trying to listen as fully as possible so that I can actually ask for clarification and flexible questions on the spot. And how I do that is, if an author says something that intrigues me in a one-on-one interview, it's probably intriguing the audience as well. And so I want to go down that rabbit hole so that the audience feels like we're all in it together, and so that we're all kind of responding to the same thing we're hearing. If I'm so focused on working through my core questions or my sub questions, the audience is just going to feel like it was fine, but it was a little stiff, right? So that's how I can't prepare for flexible questions in advance. I just have to be ready for them. And certain authors are better at even leading into flexible questions than others will. So that can also be part of it. Do you send panelists your questions ahead of time? Great question. I don't, unless the organization or the author asks. And if they do, then I give them to them. The main reason I don't is because I'm typically preparing the day before the event or the day of the event, or like really close to the event. That's just how my schedule allows. So in terms of sending them ahead, if I'm going to send it ahead, then I make a different deadline and I do them the day before that deadline. But I always send them and say, like, this is kind of the framework of questions I'm working with. I may add more. I probably won't get to all of them. I'll sort of set all that up in the email that I send them in advance. Sometimes they just want to know like categories. And so I'll just give them those sort of core. I'm going to ask you a couple questions about setting. I want to ask a little bit off the top about like how you got here to this book. And I want to finish with something like that. So if I'm really rushed and they just want to know that I've got my head on straight, I'll just give them the core questions. But usually I try and give them what I would call the sub questions, the core questions with the sub questions, if they ask, but only if they ask. We also have hosts who help end the event and keep to the time when they appear in person or turn on the video. That's a big signal. Yeah, so that's a great cheat, Sarah. Thank you for mentioning. When you have an over talker and on virtual, you can literally like just bring your host in as they're starting their answer so that they know time is out. The worst ones though still don't care. And I think I answered the question about when you're self-moderating, when you're actually on the panel yourself. It's really just about having kind of markers about how you get through the conversation. And what's really hard, I'm doing this in first week of October, I'm interviewing Omar Al-Akkad, Kim Twee, and Nicholas Reddick for Eden Mills Writers Festival. And I'm also supposed to be on the panel. And it's really hard to gauge how much you're talking and too much when you're also supposed to be a panelist. But I would say I try and either answer the question off the top or answer it on the back end, depending on what kind of question it is. Usually I try to answer it last because I use my answer to transition into the next question. So for example, I'm on the panel, I'm a fellow panelist and the moderator. I might say, okay, what was the hardest thing that you encountered when you were going through the book, working on your book? They'll all answer. It will come back to me to like move it along. And I'll say, yeah, I really identify with that. One of my big challenges was this. And that kind of leads me to my next question, right? I'm going to try and give my answer in as succinct a way as possible. So I'm not taking up a lot of time and then also asking the next question. When questions come from the virtual audience, do you just pose the question or do you acknowledge who the question is from? So I feel uncomfortable acknowledging who the question is from all the time. You'll notice here, I did it a few times, but I generally don't, because I know people can say that they're anonymous if they don't want to be known, but I'm also just not sure. So I don't always recognize all the great people who have asked the great questions because it just feels, I'm worried about pronouncing their name wrong. I'm worried about getting pronouns wrong. And that's not a worry that I'm like, oh, I'm worried. And it's just safer to just ask the question as they presented it. I don't think people generally are trying to ask a question so that people know it's from them. It's just in my personal life, like at an event, if I saw Sarah or Shashibat, I'd be like, hey, and I would acknowledge them because they're in the room. But because, we're on screens, it's not necessarily, people don't necessarily want everyone to know, and you don't know. So I just generally choose not to mention names. And even in person, it can feel a little bit like a popularity contest to acknowledge names because you're like, I remember you and I know you, but I don't know the next person that asked. So it can create kind of a power dynamic that I don't love. So I don't always. Okay. This has gone on a long time. I looked at the time and I thought it only gone on 20 minutes. I'm like, I'm pretty sure I talked for longer than that. This has gone on for a long time. I will remain here if anyone has any questions. I'm going to look in the chat if people want to say hello, goodbye.